We'd like to welcome everyone to this next edition of the Sutherland Institute Congressional Event Series. We are honored today to have in attendance Congressman Stewart, representing the 2nd Congressional District in Utah, and we're pleased to be able to convene this kind of a conversation. We're here, as the agenda indicates, to discuss America's security and Utah's leadership in military readiness. And I think it promises to be a fascinating conversation, and we appreciate all of you for being here to participate. Before we take one more step, I want to bring to the stage a young man by the name of Lincoln Offenheim to lead us in a Pledge of Allegiance. So Lincoln, could we have you come forward?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd please stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
My notes just hit the floor. We had to create a little bit of a breeze up here. It's a little warm. We acknowledge that. Hopefully you're doing okay out there. We wanted to try and preserve the congressman through his remarks. As I mentioned, Sutherland's proud to host these public dialogues and to bring Utah's elected officials in front of their constituents to talk about things that are important to all of us. The format of today's event is we're going to commence with some comments from Congressman Stewart, and then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. We want to welcome the media, and we ask that the questions you may have for Congressman Stewart, if we could have you hold those until the end. There will be time allocated for press interviews, so we'll make sure we take care of you. We have two distinguished panels. I just want to quickly thank and welcome those who are involved with the panels. Their complete bios are in your program, so I won't take the time to read them all. But I'd like to welcome Dr. Ken Gritton from the Dugway Proving Ground, Colonel Daniel Gable from Hill Air Force Base, Colonel Todd Burnley from the Tooele Army Depot, and I saved Major General Jeff Burton until the end from the Utah National Guard. Just a quick preview. As of October 12th, this fall, Major General Burton will be the newest recipient of the Sutherland Institute New Birth of Freedom Award. So we invite all of you to attend that gala event and participate in honoring General Burton for his outstanding service and the character that he demonstrates in this community. Our second panel after that, and I'll be stepping in to keep us on time a little bit, but we would just want to welcome David Bean, Senior Director, United States Air Force Mission Systems at L3 Technologies, Perry Oaks, the Utah Lead Executive from Lockheed Martin, Andy Healy, Senior Manager for Business Development from Boeing, and Justin McMurray, Director of Flight System Solutions at Northrop Grumman. We also, though his name is not on the program, we're honored to have in attendance General Tyler Smith. Thank you for being here, General, and for adding to the importance of this event. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Congressman Stewart. Really requires no introduction in this community, and he actually prefers minimal introductions. So I won't go on and on, but other than to mention the obvious, he's an outstanding representative of the 2nd Congressional District. He's an award-winning author. He's a record-setting pilot. He serves as a member of the House Appropriations Committee and House Intelligence Committee, and we're honored to have him here.
Good morning. I wonder, should we turn this off? Can you hear me? Leave it on? Okay, some are saying yes and some are saying no. Democracy, we could vote on it. We'll leave it on, but if you can't hear me, let me know, and I'm gonna try to speak up a little bit. I'm honored to be here, Rick. Thank you for the invitation. And we are a little bit late. I'm gonna abbreviate my remarks a little bit. I'm gonna be brief anyway. Julius Caesar was a great general. He won many battles, but he liked to give long speeches, and his generals killed him. And I look here and I see all these generals. I'm surrounded by them. And I know the military loves brevity. That's one of the things I love about the military. So I am going to only speak for a few minutes, and it's funny because I thought that I knew what I wanted to say, and I was running this morning, and I started thinking, no, I'm going to talk about that, I'm going to talk about that, and I ended up jotting down all these notes that I hope I can follow them because I've completely changed the message I want to share with you today. And it's going to be a little different. Instead of talking, and we will a little, instead of talking about necessarily my work on intel and some of the concerns from an intelligence perspective, I want to go up to about 100,000 feet and talk about something broader in addition to that, or maybe as an introduction to that. And in this introduction, I would like you to pay attention to the first and the last thing I say in this. I'm going to highlight them because I think they are the most important. And the first thing I want to say to you is this: I believe in the goodness and in the future of our country. Though imperfect, and I'll emphasize that, we are not perfect. We are still the greatest force of good, I think, in the history of mankind. No other nation has done what we've done. We have literally freed hundreds of millions of people from tyranny. Our model of free markets and liberal democracy has lifted more people out of poverty and given more people freedom than any other government or philosophy or economic model, again, in the history of mankind, in the history of the world. And I think more important than that, you go into this, no other nation has devolved more power to the people. No other nation has created more creative or innovative genius. No other nation has been so guarded against human tyranny. And no other nation has been as unselfish or as benevolent to other nations and other people as has the United States. But this is now the end of my introduction. I want you to pay attention to this as well. I'll say the first part again. I believe in the goodness and the future of our country. The second part is this: we are wrong if we think we can continue down a path of peace and prosperity, making bad decisions along the way, and that eventually those decisions will not catch up to us. We are always free to choose, as a people, individually, and as a nation, but we are never free to choose the consequences of the decisions that we've already made. And my fear is that we have reached an inflection point where a couple generations of what I believe are poor decisions will inevitably lead to consequences that may be difficult, that in fact will be difficult for our country, and that we are going to have to deal with that. I'm going to try something here. I don't know if any of you are going to be able to see this. Can you see this? Some of you? Is that better? Some of you know I don't consider myself a historian at all. But I've had a chance to write a little bit about history and have been successful at that. And I think there's a bit of a perception that this is the arc of history that we hear about. You have time and you have power. In fact, I'm going to reverse those. And a nation will rise in its power, and we've seen this again and again throughout history, and then at some point it reaches its apex of power, and then eventually over time it diminishes in power. And I think that's a fair description, and it's very simple, something that we can all understand. But I really think this arc looks something a little different. I really think it looks something more like that. You have times when you reach a pinnacle and you have a momentary decline, where you reach a crisis and many people in the midst of that crisis think perhaps we're here and we're on this inevitable fall. And I don't think that's true. I mean, we had moments in history right after or even during the Revolutionary War where there were declines, and I think people at that time lost hope and said, this is too difficult, we can't do this. You had the Civil War. That was certainly a cycle down where people wondered where we are, what's the inevitable conclusion of our nation, where will we end up? You had maybe the winning of the Cold War. You could put Vietnam in the 1970s in there, somewhere in this cycle, and we wonder where we are. Are we here, or are we here? And have we actually started this arc of decline? And the truth is that we don't know. I don't think the end days are next week. They may be 1,000 years from now. They may be 10 years from now. I don't think that we really know. But I do think, and I want to come back to the conclusion I made earlier, and that is that the results of our decisions are inevitable unless we change those decisions and unless we modify them in some way. The rise of a great nation takes time. It took 150 years for our country. I don't think a nation falls overnight. I don't think a great nation disappears in a puff of harmless smoke. And I think it's fairly predictable if you can look at some of the indicators or some of the, as I said, the decisions that a nation or a people have been making. I'm asked all the time, what is the greatest threat, the greatest danger facing our country? And part of the reason I'm asked that is because of my position on Intel and because of my military background. And I don't pretend that I'm any smarter than any of these men or women sitting here in uniform, or any of you who have specialties in this area or have background or just have been alive and have been observant of the world. So I don't say to you that my insights are more keen or more precise, but I do think that there's some things that we could agree on and that won't surprise many of you. And when you ask the question, what is the greatest danger facing our country, it's really an unfair question. It's an imprecise question. It's a question that's nearly impossible to answer because you have to define, well, what is the greatest danger? What does that mean? Admiral Harris, who's one of my friends and a guy I have just tremendous respect for, recently retired as commander of PACOM, Pacific Command. He had a third of the military was under his command. I mean, enormous responsibilities. Geographically, the largest command in the world. And when I remember talking with him, and he said something to me that I wrote down and I remembered and I've shared with other people before, and that is, you have to break him in and look at him through a different prism or a different lens. He said, Russia is the only existential threat that we face. North Korea is the most dangerous situation we face. And China is the most complicated situation we face. Well, in the overall context, which is the most dangerous or what's the greatest threat, it's difficult to answer. Because one of them is existential, one of them is very dangerous, very imminent, and one of them is very complicated. And I think you could extend those arguments almost to any threat that we may have to encounter. Cyber, for example, or the mullahs in Iran and Islamic fascism that we've been dealing with for half a generation now. There are some common threads, though, that bring all of these together. They're a little bit different, and I'll describe the differences, although briefly, but I want to emphasize the commonalities first. And that is, if you ask what does Vladimir Putin really want? Well, he wants a couple things. He wants to rebuild the former Warsaw. Now, he's doing that through various means. I actually did an editorial for this, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, and we made the point saying he has been very effective at rebuilding not necessarily the former Warsaw, but he has essentially nearly that level of influence through defense ministers in these countries, through finance ministers in these countries, through oligarchs and business enterprises, and in some cases through actual leadership or prime ministers in these countries. And he's convinced many of them to look east rather than look west. So there's that, that's what he wants. But more broadly, he wants to weaken the US. He wants to prove that the idea of a liberal democracy will ultimately fail. He wants to prove that the idea of capitalism will not suffice for the needs of the people, that it will lead to something we hear about all the time now, income inequality, that it won't take care of the needs of the poor, and that there's another economic model that's more efficient and more effective and not as stressful and not as encrusted in debate and in some of the other emotions that we see so frequently right now. President Xi is certainly making that argument. And you would ask, what does President Xi want? And we'll discuss that briefly. Well, President Xi, unlike President Putin, doesn't want to rebuild his part of the world. The Chinese government has a very specific plan to, by the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Communist Party in China, 2048, to be not a peer to the United States, but to be the single dominant power in the world. But along that way, what does he want? He wants to weaken the United States. He wants to embarrass the United States. He wants to prove that a liberal democracy will ultimately fail and that capitalism won't serve the needs of its people. So although some of these are different, there are threads that bind them as well. There are goals that they share. In some cases, they will work together. In some cases, they won't. But again, they have commonalities that they feel and that they have implemented through policy directed towards the United States. In giving examples or trying to illustrate, I think, this question of what is the greatest danger that we face, maybe the best way or a way to do that is by sharing some examples from that and then learning if there are lessons that we could learn from that. And the first one I want to share with you is experience I had, and I can't say where, but I can give you the general locality along the Syrian border. This is, I think, last summer. Might have been just before that. But we were there to look at some things that we were doing in the area. And while we were there, I found myself in a refugee processing center. And that wasn't my purpose in being there, but I was glad that I got to be there because even though I couldn't interact with those, and they didn't really want me there for different reasons, but I got a chance to observe it for a period of time at least. And while I was there, I was in a small room and with a couple of refugees, and we were separated, but we were waiting, and we ended up being quite a while. And so I said to the person that was with us, I said, can I talk to this family over here? Because there was something very obvious that had gone on in their lives, and the father had a terribly disfigured face, and he had some young children with him. And they kind of worked it out, and although reluctantly, they said, okay. And so they introduced me to him and provided an interpreter, and I asked him, can you tell me your story? And I said, were you ever part of the rebels? Were you working against the resistance against Bashar al-Assad? He said, no. Said, that's the last thing in the world I wanted to do. Said, I just wanted to raise my family. I just wanted to keep my head down. I just wanted us to be safe. But he said, but I made a terrible mistake. And before I tell you that, I'll tell you he had 3 sons with him, but he had an older daughter who he didn't know where she was. He thought she was in Turkey. He had another older daughter. He didn't know where she was. He thought she was in Jordan. But he had lost contact with his teenage daughters, and that's not a hopeful sign for him. And I said, well, what happened? And as I said, he said, I made a terrible mistake. And I said, what did you do? And he said, I was talking to my neighbor one night, and I said to him, I hope one day we can live under freedom. And he said, the next night, Syrian soldiers came into my home, and they broke in, they held me and my family, and they asked me, did you say this? And he said, I did. And he said they took out a knife and they started to cut off his face. And then they broke all the bones in his face with the butts of their rifle. Then they arrested him and his 2 sons and threw him in prison. One of the great challenges we face isn't just refugees, which is something that some of us have a great interest in. It's in instability in that region. It's the threat to Israel. It's the breaking of coalitions that have, although not perfect, have helped to bring some of the stability to a very, very dynamic and unstable region for a couple generations now. One of the efforts that I'm very involved with is this fracturing of the GCC, the Gulf States Coalition, where some of the Gulf states have targeted Qatar, and it's begun to fracture the coalition that is very, very important to us. So in general, I think that's a good example. That's a challenge that we face. Would I say it's the greatest challenge we face? It depends. But it's a challenge, and it's something we're going to have to deal with. Let me come back to Russia, if I could, and I'm going to do so briefly because many of us are generally aware of that, and we've already talked a little bit about Vladimir Putin's success in rebuilding the influence in his part of the world and his goals to weaken the U.S. I was in Moscow the summer before the election, 2016. And again, mostly dealing with intelligence issues. And I wish we had time to talk about it. Just a fascinating experience. But to give you a sense of how I was treated there, when I landed there, first place they wouldn't give me my visa until I was actually en route. So I didn't get my visa to enter the country until I was in Paris, waiting on the airplane to come. But I was assured again and again and again, we'll get it, we'll get it. But it was just one of the little harassing things they would do along the way. And our diplomats there are harassed every day in horrible ways. It's a very, very difficult posting right now, as Mr. Huntsman can tell you. And when we landed, I was in the second row to the front of the aircraft, and they wouldn't let anyone off, and we kind of wondered. And then this older lady comes on. She's about that tall, and she looked like she was in the 70s. And she comes up in her 70s, sorry, not in the 70s. She comes up, and she unfolds this kind of old-fashioned video camera, and she stands right before me, and she starts videotaping, and then they said, okay, you can leave, and I was the first one off the aircraft, and she walking backwards, she follows me all the way through security until I was picked up by my escort. And I mean, that was the message they were sending to me and to others there, and other Americans there. We know who you are, we know why you're here, and we're going to watch everything you do. I was in the Baltic states about the same time, and I remember standing on a church tower, looking across the border and seeing Russian, I don't know the size of the unit, a division, a battalion, I'm sorry, Jeff, I lose track of the Army vernacular on that, but it was a bunch of them, of Russian tanks that you could see sitting across the border. And I can tell you the Baltics have legitimate reason to be afraid. Because the reality is Vladimir Putin could take them in 48 hours if he wanted to, and there's not a thing in the world we could do about it initially. And then the question we have is, are we willing to go to war with Russia over the Baltics? And the thing we have to decipher is, does Vladimir Putin know the answer to that question? They've isolated them with Kaliningrad, which has created a virtual island of freedom nearly surrounded by Russian influence. And for a generation, Russia's been preparing to influence them and eventually to suppress them if necessary. A third of the citizens in the Baltics are ethnically Russian. And they've made these terrible decisions to separate. They're educated in Russian schools. They speak Russian. And they're very different. They don't integrate nearly so well into the community as they should. And so that's going to allow Russia, if they choose, to say this is a grassroots uprising. We have nothing to do with it. The little green men, much like we saw in Crimea, and much like we saw in eastern Ukraine. And it leaves them in a very, very tenuous situation. So we have to look at some of the ambitions of Vladimir Putin. And he's demonstrated those ambitions very clearly. You can't look at the Crimea and say, well, that doesn't mean anything. You can't look at eastern Ukraine and say, well, that doesn't mean anything. And you can't look at massing along the Baltic states and not say that he's not trying to send us a message there. Let me talk about China very quickly again. South China Sea, I think most of us are familiar with that, where they've taken atolls that are not much bigger than this room and turned them into military installations. And not just one, but 7 or 8 or nearly a dozen. At some point we'll hit nearly a dozen. And they said all along and promising, no, these are not military installations, while they're building hangars for aircraft, and while they're building fuel storage facilities, and while they're installing anti-aircraft and missile defense. All the while claiming that no, these aren't military installations. And the previous administration just ignored it. And now we have to decide what we're going to do with it. Again, if you want to read something interesting, go Google One Belt, One Road and spend a few minutes reading about their plan. Their plan is really too weak of a word. It's something more than that. But they are meticulous and dedicated and committed and on schedule to, as I said, be the dominant world power by 2048. Another interesting thing, another kind of milestone along that road is their, what they call Made in China 2025. In fact, we wrote an editorial about this subject last week. Many of us think of Made in China and they think of, creating these little trinkets that you buy at grocery stores or Walmart, and we think, well, this isn't, an issue of national security. But for a generation now, China has been stealing very effectively our most sensitive, not only commercial, but national security intellectual property. And the nutty thing is we've allowed them to do it in far too many cases. One of the most important pieces of legislation we've signed in years was, and I wish we had time to go into this, was CFIUS. Okay, I've got to quit. We got to do, but you started late, Rick. We do want to save time for a few questions and answers, but let me just say this. CFIUS was that's something hardly anyone's heard of, but it's Committee for the Foreign Investment in the U.S., and they would review these investments by foreign nations, particularly China. And for a generation, we've been saying, yeah, you know what? Money matters more than national security. And we've been allowing these investments, knowing it would harm our national security. And finally, last week, we reformed that process and made it much more difficult. Tying into one other thing, and that's cyber, and I wish we had time to talk about cyber, which I think is, everyone goes, well, cyber threat, yeah, that's dangerous. And that means, worst case, that Amazon's going to shut down, and I won't be able to shop at Amazon for 48 hours. And for a lot of people, that's a national crisis, right? By the way, as a complete aside, and I shouldn't take time to tell you this, but my wife ordered something off Amazon the other day, and I don't know what she was thinking, where she misread this, but, we needed brushes for our family, hairbrushes, right? So she ordered a package of hairbrushes, 380 of them. We got a box that's as big as this podium. And they're hygienic products, so you can't return them. So if any of you want any hairbrushes, please call me, because we've been giving away 380 of them. We got a long ways to go. People don't understand that the threat of cyber isn't just that your email is shut down, or that Amazon won't send you the Fruit Loops for breakfast in the morning. It's much, much more serious than that. And if you want to think what the ultimate outcome could be, imagine something similar to an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, or the electrical grid being taken down for months. You don't have the fan to cool it here. You don't have gasoline pumps that will give you gas in your car. Hospitals don't have electricity. Transportation shuts down, refrigeration shuts down, banking shuts down. It's a real concern. Well, I know I've been a little Pollyannish and a little Debbie Downer. The world's going to end, the sky is falling. I want to come back to where I started. I believe in the future of our country. I believe in the innate, God-given goodness of this country. I think God still cares about this country. And I think we can overcome these challenges. But we cannot expect it to be easy unless we are willing to confront them in ways we haven't been willing to before. And by the way, most important thing I could say maybe, I don't think any one of these nations or these interests could destroy us. All they can do is assist us if we decide to commit suicide. And that's the thing we have to ask ourselves. Do we think this nation is still worth defending? Do we think that the internal rule of law still matters? If I had more time, I'd love to talk to you about the Department of Justice and FBI and the corruption that has been manifest there. Not among agents generally at all, but among senior officials in some of those agencies. And it comes back to this idea. Do we think that these principles are worth defending? And I promise you they are. Thank you for giving me just a few minutes to spend with you today. I look forward to, I think I'm moderating the panel, and I'm going to turn the time back over to Rick. But God bless you all, as always, forever. God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
I was so looking forward to hosting this until I realized I'm the guy that shortens his speech. I didn't want to do that. I could listen to this all day. And in fact, before we go into the next panel, why don't we open up, we have time for just a couple of questions, depending on the complexity of the question. But would anyone like to ask a question of Congressman Stewart before we go into the panel discussion?
A free hairbrush to anyone who asks a question.
The hairbrush thing has been covered. We got right here. I think we got one right here. A mic is on the way if you want to. Oh, he wanted a hairbrush.
You
Okay.
commented on corruption in the highest levels of the Justice Department. I know you don't have a lot of time, but would you comment a little more fully on that?
Yeah, and look, in doing so, I don't want to sound partisan, and I don't want to sound like I've lost my mind. And I call my brother Ted, who's a U.S. federal judge here, and a man that I trust as much as anyone that I know, and is hardly a radical. And some of you know him. This is, again, someone I respect as much as anyone else. Say to him once, well, Ted, tell me, have I lost my bearings? Am I making a big deal out of something that isn't? Tell me if I'm losing my mind. But listen, this is what we know, briefly. We know that Hillary Clinton and the DNC paid a foreign agent who then used Russian agents to create a dossier. And then that dossier was presented before the FISA courts dishonestly. They hid from them the fact that it was paid for, what the origins of it. They hid from them the fact of its sources and subsources, and they presented that as if it were actual FBI intelligence. And then they were dishonest and have been stonewalling everywhere along the way as we've tried to discuss that. And there's more to it than that, but we know that that is true. And you had an FBI agent who was involved both in the investigation into Hillary Clinton and the investigation into Donald Trump, who he and others around him evidenced the most visceral, not just dislike or distrust, but frankly, hatred toward individuals. Just as an example, describing walking into Walmart and saying, I could smell the Trump voters. And for that type of emotion, and for that type of clear bias to not have been identified, and for those individuals to be given this type of responsibility, and then, and this is the key to this, and then this individual comes to testify before Congress, and he gets a standing ovation from some people, from individuals across the aisle. Why in the world would you not think that is a bad idea? How can you say it's okay to run, they say, informants? What's the difference between an informant and a spy? You explain it to me. If it smells like a cow and moves like a cow and walks like a cow, it's a stinking cow. So you can call it an informant. I'm going to call it a spy. And if you're running spies into the opposing campaign, then I want to know why. Show me the reason why. And if there's reasons why you had to do that, I completely accept that. But if you did it for political reasons, if you have weaponized the Department of Justice and the FBI, and in some cases the CIA, that is a meaningful thing. And the American people deserve to know that. And those individuals should be held accountable. And that's where I come back to this thing about, look, is this worth defending? Because that's a fundamental question there. Or you just shrug and say, well, that's just the way it is. Because it's not the way it is, and it's not the way it should be. And it's one of the great challenges we've had is to understand what happened there and to hold individuals accountable. Thank you.
One more? Please.
What's your sense of the mood in Congress for funding an adequate surface Navy?
Yeah, well, and I would extend that question, what's the sense in Congress for funding an adequate renewed ICBM force and Air Force? When I was in the Air Force, 157 fighter squadrons, something like 56 today, although increasing now. The mood is generous, but it's difficult because of this. It's interesting. I use this once in a while. This is from the Bank of Zimbabwe. Some of you have seen something like this. This is a $10 billion bill. Now that's an illustration of inflation, right? And the reason I show you that is, you say, what does that have to do with your question? And the reason I ran for Congress in 2012 was because of our debt and our spending. It was the primary threat that I thought that we had facing our country. Many of us at the time were there for the same reasons. So on one hand, we think debt and spending and $10 billion bills, the ultimate result of that, is a real concern. On the other hand, we went through this period of time where we recognized the military just wasn't adequately funded for this responsibility we have. Whether we like it or not, we have this responsibility to adequately defend ourselves and defend freedom in certain places around the world. And these two things were in conflict. To answer your question, many have moved over from this side, as I have, to this, where we've said we have to spend more money on our military. And so the question is, the appetite for it is generous right now. Now, we can't fund everything all at once, and we have to prioritize. And there are those who will say the Navy is absolutely the priority, and I actually lean towards that because of their responsibility in free shipping and other global responsibilities they have. But generally speaking, their appetite to fund the military at rates that we believe were insufficient previous and have to be addressed. The question then is, what are the priorities of that funding? And that's a conversation that's still going on. Thank you all again. It's good to be with you, Rick. Thank you again for the invitation.
We're going to call a quick audible. A couple of members of the media, and we appreciate their attendance. We think that's very important. There's a value in the free press. They have a couple of questions and they have to go. We're going to rearrange just a little bit. And if there are, let's open up for a couple of questions from the press before we go into our first panel discussion. We're there. Okay, here, over here.
Lee Davidson, Salt Lake Tribune. Wasn't planning to ask this, but can you comment more on the threat that Russia portrays? You were talking about infiltrating the Hillary Clinton campaign.
You're talking about in regards to interference in our elections, primarily?
Primarily,
Yeah.
everything else too.
Yeah, so when I mentioned I was in Moscow, when I came home, I said to Lee, I think to you and other members of the press, both locally and nationally, I said, Russia's going to interfere with our elections. That wasn't based on any specific piece of evidence. It was based on a collection of it, but it was also based on just history and precedent and experience. They've been doing this for generations. They're what we call active measures, which this is one of the tools, goes back deep into the Cold War and frankly before that. The second question I was inevitably asked when they said, well, they're going to interfere with our elections, they said, well, who do they want to win? And I said, I don't think they care. They just want to break down the foundations of democracy. They want to break down trust in our electoral process. They want us to distrust and to hate each other. And if that was their goal, and I believe that it was, they have been very effective at it. Now, we don't have any evidence at all that they were able to penetrate any voting machines. Not a single vote was changed so far as we can tell at this point, and I'm fairly confident in that. That doesn't mean they won't be able to. And one of the things we've had to address in the last year, and we've done it with a substantial amount of money, is to be able to run interference with the states to help them build and assure firewalls that protect the voting systems and the voting machines that are used. Some of it is fairly easy, and that's an example of an easy one. Some of it is harder. Facebook has billions of ads and posts, and millions are added every day. How do you monitor those? We saw an example last week where they identified, I think it was 32 or it might have been 36 entities that were posting and again, focusing on very divisive issues. But that's a few dozen out of millions and millions. And I think at the end of the day, Lee, what we have to rely on is the intelligence and the goodwill of the American people to be able to self-filter and for them to be able to see, hopefully, that some of these things are intended to be divisive and not to move the conversation forward. That's one of the keys, although not the only one. Russia's going to continue to do this. They've done it in Europe. They'll do it in 2018 here. They'll do it in 2020. Our awareness of it is helpful, but it's got to be more than that.
What did you take away from the Putin-Trump summit, and what do you expect the relationship to be going forward from that?
Yeah. I was actually on the airplane when the president held his press conference, so when I landed and was able to view part of that, I think I did 12 or 15 interviews on national TV in the next day or two, where I said, Mr. President, what you said isn't true, and you need to correct the record, and you should do it now. Because for him to cast doubt on some of the conclusions of the Intel Committee and Intelligence community just wasn't accurate. And he did that, although I was a little disappointed in his correction. I thought it could have been a little more forceful as well. But here's the thing, and at the end of the day, it comes down to this. For almost 2 years now, this president and other people around him have been accused not of jaywalking or stealing bubblegum, they've been accused of treason. Virtually every day by many, many people. And I can understand why some of them get weary of that. It's had incredibly negative impacts on some individuals' lives for which there is no evidence that they did anything wrong. And I can understand why he becomes defensive about that. And the second thing I would say is this. He makes my job harder with some of his tweets and some of the things he said in that press conference is an example of that. But putting aside what he said and how ineloquent he might have been, who is the president who went to NATO and said, you have to increase your spending on defense? And the point of that, of course, is Russia. Who was the president who said to the United States, we are going to increase our spending on defense? And not the only point, but one of the points of that is to be able to counter Russian aggression. Who is the president who said, we are going to drive down the cost of energy and make the United States the most efficient oil exporter in the world? That's their goal. And if you want to put an economic sanction on Russia, that's the most powerful thing we could do because they're so dependent on the price of energy, particularly oil, for their foreign currency. Who's the president who said we're going to back up our allies in Ukraine when the previous administration would not send them kinetic weapons, sent them MREs and little else? This president said we're going to give you the tools to defend yourselves. So, and look, I understand this because it is controversial. I understand that some people disagree with this. But when you look at this administration's actions, they have been clearly willing to confront Vladimir Putin and to build structures that would be able to do that, which is why his press conference was so frustrating to me, because it clouded that reality and created this, and it fell into this, this image that he somehow prefers a strongman like Vladimir Putin, who we know is a KGB thug.
Okay, have we accommodated the... Okay. What we'll do now is move on to our first panel, which actually will be moderated by Congressman Stewart. So if we could invite up General Burton, Colonel Burnley, Colonel Gable, and Dr. Gretton, we can move forward with that first discussion.
I think back on my comments about being surrounded by generals and being brief. Thank you for not killing me because I did go a little long. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Your reputations precede you. I think everyone here knows who you are. But just for the sake of clarity, General Burton, would you introduce yourself and provide any introductory remarks that you think are a good way to get started on this? And then, Colonel, we'll just go down the line if we could.
Okay, thank you, Congressman Stewart. It's an honor to be with you this morning. By way of introduction, Jeff Burton, commander of the Army and the Air Guard in Utah. We have about 7,300 Army soldiers and airmen. And just as a point of interest, at any particular time, we're in about 20 foreign nations at any given time. We have a Special Forces group of Green Berets. We have the only linguist brigade in the United States Army inventory. And that keeps us very busy across the globe. The other thing that's interesting to note is the National Guard is an operational force. And what does that mean? It means that things have changed a little bit since 9/11. We are, in many cases, rapid deployment forces. We're some of the first forces that hit the field. In my case, particularly in 2003, one of the first battalion-sized units that was called up was the one I commanded. And so the National Guard is different, and thus our relationship with employers is different. We've asked a great deal of our employers over the last 17 years, and we're very grateful for the support that we've received, because these citizen soldiers have to just pick up and move out at a very short notice. Currently, we have about 600 deployed across the globe, and that number is going to increase another couple of hundred in the next few months. And so we are fully engaged around the globe. We in the reserve component make up 50% of the nation's response. And the last thing I would say is, if you study history, we are a militia nation, i.e., the founders wanted us to have a small standing military. The realities of the world over the last 70 years have changed a lot. Our military has gotten larger, but we have never moved from this notion of the citizen soldier. And I'm a firm believer in it. We swear an oath to the Constitution, and we, like our active duty brothers, love this country. We're not politicians. We seek to provide politicians with the ability to exert the will of the United States, first to defend our own folks, and then to exert national policy as our politicians see fit. And so we're honored to serve, and hopefully that gives you kind of a nutshell of who the National Guard is in Utah specifically.
Thanks, General. If you ever, you said something important, you are a soldier, not a politician. If you ever wake up and you're a little discouraged, just tell yourself, hey, at least I'm not Chris Stewart, right? So.
Okay, Congressman, I will. Thank you, sir.
Colonel Gable.
Yes, Congressman, I'd like to second the notion to thank you for your time, for everyone showing up this morning. So my name is Dan Gable. I'm a colonel up at Hill Air Force Base. I'm the Vice Wing Commander of the 419th Fighter Wing, which is a reserve wing. So our wing is part of that 50% reserve component. I, ironically, am active duty, the only active duty member in the wing. It's an initiative that we do up at Hill. Everything is integrated up there between the 388th and the 419th Fighter Wings. And our primary mission combined as the two wings is to train, to deploy F-35 combat power anywhere in the world that we need to do. And that's our primary mission. For the 419th specifically, we provide manpower for that mission or any others that are needed to go. Citizen airmen, just as the general said, about 90% of our personnel are living in northern Utah and will be in a decade from now, and they'll still be in our unit. On the active duty side, rotate out every few years. It's actually my third tour back at Hill, so I'm sort of both pots of reservist kind of mentality of I've been here for 20 years, but I've had some gaps in between. We have about 200 full-time people in our wing and about 1,000 weekend warriors, those that work in the community and have other jobs and then give up 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year to work 12 days straight or more and give up their time to fight the fight or be ready to fight the fight.
So my family and I went out to the air show a couple weeks ago. It's a beautiful airplane. Love the F-35. But can we agree that the B-1 is the coolest airplane ever built?
No, sir.
No. Okay, we'll talk about that offline then. All right, from Tooele.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Congressman Stewart. Thanks for everybody showing up today, and also appreciate the invitation here to speak today. I'm out at Tooele Army Depot. I'm probably the most recent resident to Utah. I just took command last month, so my perspective on Utah may be a little bit different from everybody else who's been here a couple more times than I have. I'm also the only military person out there at Tooele Depot, so that's probably one of the lesser known facts. We have about 500 civilians out there right now, and really our primary mission is to provide munitions for our warfighters around the globe. So we push munitions to virtually every corner of the globe, as well in the United States here. And I think that's about it, sir.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to that because there's things there about Tooele that a lot of people here don't know that we hope to emphasize. And then someone who I've gotten to know over the last few years, have tremendous respect for, Ken, Dr. Gritton.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you for your participation. I'm Ken Gritton from the Dugway Proving Ground. I serve as the technical director and the deputy to the commander. Colonel Hoskins, who is not here because he's officiating in a formal military ceremony this morning, so he sends his regrets and his regards. The Dugway Proving Ground is the nation's chemical and biological defense testing range. We have chemical and biological laboratories certified to use actual live chemical and biological warfare agents and their appropriate simulants. We test with all chemical and biological warfare agents and their simulants under very controlled conditions so that when we go out of doors to test chemical and biological defensive equipment in a threat representative scenario, we can tie the performance of the equipment in the out of doors with simulants back to how it performed appropriately in the laboratories with chemical warfare agents. So it allows us to provide our warfighters with information. Our warfighters, our first responders, our special forces, all of those people who might be operating in a chemically or biologically contaminated environment, we provide them confidence in the performance of the defensive materials that they have. In addition, we have a number of people at Dugway who have in-theater war experience. These people complement our scientists and engineers by allowing special forces operators, conventional forces, first responders, and other specific and important customers, i.e. the three-letter agencies, to come to Dugway, or we can deploy to them to help them understand, recognize, and neutralize any chemical or biological threat that they might encounter. And this includes pharmaceutical-based threats, aka opioids and fentanyls. So we're happy to be here and happy to provide that service for our nation, sir.
Okay. Well, again, to the panelists, thank you all. And this is an interesting group, and if I could just synopsize and highlight, we have one of the premier national experts on biological or chemical offensive and defensive capabilities, logistics, munitions, because as General Patton said, an army travels on its stomach, or something like that, didn't he say? Turns out that if you're gonna engage the enemy, you have to have munitions, you have to have logistics and a long supply chain behind it. We have air power represented here, global reach, global power, and air superiority, which I don't think you can win a war without it. But there's no sense having air superiority if the soldiers on the ground aren't taking territory and defending national interests, which General Burton would represent. So all of you are part of this incredibly complex and sophisticated and enormous machine that is our defense and national interest of defending America's interests, but you represent a slightly different point of that. So I'd be interested to ask a general question, and that is, if you were to ask or answer, what's the greatest threat? What's the top priority facing our country from your perspective or from your view? Anyone have an opinion on that?
I think we all do. I mean, from my perspective, it's very clear. What our citizens require is a strong defensive capability. I think the most important thing any government can do is provide security for its citizens. And so when you need us, you expect that we're prepared to go and close with and destroy the enemy in close combat. That's what we do. And so everything we do, all of our resources are focused on being prepared to do that at a moment's notice, not 30, 60, 90 days later. And so that's the big change with the Guard, is being ready to go now and to provide that defense when it's required. So job one, readiness of our force.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yes, sir. Just to add on to that, I think from our perspective, at least out at the depot, predictable and consistent funding makes a huge impact to our operations. Without funding, obviously, we can't start new work, and we can't provide the resources that our warfighters may need forward.
You hit a sore spot with me. I gotta comment on that if I could. Among the audience, if I said a CR, talking about government funding, do you know what a CR is? Okay, continuing resolution. It's shameful that you all know what that is, because we should never have to talk about it. What about an omnibus? Has everyone heard of an omnibus? Of course, we all have. And our soldiers and sailors and airmen are the brunt of that policy, that absurd policy, where we cannot adequately and predictably fund the United States government, which, as it turns out, the United States military is a part of the U.S. government. And coming back to my comment here and holding up the $10 billion bill, debt and spending, and understanding that that's important as well. But as I sit on the Appropriations Committee, we have 12 appropriations bills. And by the way, the House has passed all 12 of them, not just out of committee, actually out of the House. We did this year, we will shortly. We did all of them last year. We sent them to the Senate, where all good things go to die. 420-something bills waiting in the Senate right now, including our appropriations bills. And what happens is it never gets through the Senate, and then they jam it into an appropriations, into an omnibus, and they throw it back to us and say, vote on this by tomorrow. And it's an absurd way to govern. And that's the reason I voted against the omnibus last year. just as a protest. It was my own committee. It was my own work. And I just said, this is insane the way we're doing this, and it has to change. And you all take the brunt of that, no doubt about it. And we hear that again and again and again. Our soldiers and the programs in the military take the brunt of that. And it makes it very difficult for you to do your job. Any other thoughts on greatest challenges or threats? Yes, Doctor.
I need to echo the comments that have already been made. It's about the readiness of our warfighters, the state and non-state actors out there that are developing new threats, constantly evolving chemical, biological, as well as other conventional threats. We can never be caught flat-footed. And the bad guys are pretty smart, but so are we. We can never be caught flat-footed. We always have to be ready. It's about the readiness of the warfighter.
So General Gable, well, go ahead with your comment, then I have a question for you on that.
I wish it was General, Congressman.
I'm sorry.
No
Colonel,
problem.
Yeah.
I wish someday maybe. Thanks. I'll piggyback your concerns about cyber, frankly. And as a kinetic provider, it hurts me to say that, but frankly, the F-35, you name anything out there, it's networked. Internet of Things, whatever you want to call it, there's nothing you do without a network. And you don't have to shut down power grids and all that to disrupt somebody. My iPhone was wiped yesterday morning, not by me. Who knows who did it? And it was my work iPhone. So that's minor disruption. You add that up to 1,000 people getting that in the same day, and that starts impacting things. Media, you talked about social media. You can change opinion just through what's on social media. How many people read a Facebook post and get angry? You incite a lot of people. It doesn't have to be an external actor. It could be anybody. So just, to me, cyber is a big concern. And that's the one that I'd say keeps me up at night. And you can go as far as shutting down weapon systems and grids and all that.
Yeah. If we could do a demonstration with you of the capability of some nation states to access your phone, you'd throw your phone away, frankly. And your ability to protect it is, unless you quit using it, your ability to protect it is almost zero. They can come in, they could get your password, download everything on your phone, put on devices that where you think your phone is turned off. Hey, I'll turn my phone off. It looks like it's turned off, it's not. They can turn on your microphone, turn on your camera so they can listen to your conversations, see who you're talking to. It's pretty well, amazing in a depressing kind of way, amazing stuff. I want to come to readiness if I could and talk and have both of you address this perhaps. When I was flying, we flew 20, 25 hours a month, something like that. Tell us about your pilots, maybe not just in your squadron, but throughout the Air Force. Are they getting the training and the flying hours they need? And General Burton, are they getting the training, your soldiers getting the training they need to maintain readiness?
Yeah, we're very good at operating on smaller budgets, frankly. And so you hear the weekend warrior term. We haven't used that in about 17, 18 years because we're not. If you think about, I've got an Apache battalion here. You think about an Apache pilot and the complexity of that aircraft. Those folks are flying, training about 100 days a year. And these are folks that may work at Zion's Bank or at the corner grocery store. And they're on orders flying 100 days a year to maintain proficiency in that aircraft. So we are getting what we need, although it's a fight every year to make sure that the budgets are there. We have used what's called OCO, Overseas Contingency Funding, to fill the gap, the shortages in our budgets. And that's kind of funny money, and it's kind of dried up in recent years. And so this is a concern, and that's why we work with our congressional delegation to get that predictable funding. But right now we're holding serve. I do worry about readiness decreasing if budgets aren't put there. Bottom line is wars are won by ground forces. We cannot win a war without air superiority, and we've enjoyed it for 70 years. But terrain is held on the ground, bottom line. And people are your largest cost.
Anything you want to add?
Congressman, as far as the specific flying hours, 5 out of my last 6 years have been flying between the F-16 and the F-35, and so I've seen a little bit. I've seen the dips. I've seen the struggling to cover as many missions as we're trying to do, so we've had to make decisions. And at the cost of some of the higher-end warfighting training, we will do close air support training and what we need now. I will say I've noticed an upswing in the number of hours. That has come down as flying hours, and so I feel confident, especially with the F-35. There was a little extra flying hour with that program. As we're bringing pilots online, we have a little more, and we are getting a good amount of flying right now that I feel like we are ready already. And as we get more, we'll just be more prepared for the higher and higher echelons of the
Yeah.
fight.
And so, and I understand, and I don't mean to put you all in a difficult position. Your answer is, yes, we're ready. Yes, we can go fight. Yes, we can do what we've been tasked to do, and that's what you have to say, and that's true. But it's not true universally. And we're aware of fighter squadrons that when I was flying 20, 25 hours a month, which isn't a lot, some squadrons and some pilots have been flying 4 and 6. Well, you can't safely land and take off an aircraft if you're flying 4 hours a month, let alone deployed as a weapon system. And the Navy, to your question about global naval force, and then the Navy has had clear indications of insufficient training. And we've seen that in some of the incidents that, where we've had collisions with ships and other things, and deficiencies in training because of deficiencies in funding. And we put some of those soldiers and sailors in very difficult situations where we ask them to do things, but we don't give them the training that they need to do it. It's inexcusable. One more question. I'm older, I think, than everyone here, up here. We won't argue over that. When I came into the military in the mid-'80s, we fully expected to fight the Russians in the Fulda Gap in Germany. That was kind of our frame of thinking. And then it changed. And the Cold War changed a lot of things, and then things changed again because of 9/11. And I'm looking out at the audience. I'm looking for some young people. I don't see anyone that would suffice for my example. But I mean, I talked to a group of high school kids last week, and they had all been born since 9/11. And they didn't remember us at a time when that was, you know, what defined our military and in some cases our defense strategy. 9/11 changed things as well. So if you can compare traditional warfare, which was, you know, what I was thinking of when I was a young lieutenant or a captain, and then the changes after 9/11, and then the changes that we're experiencing now, can you kind of give us a frame of reference or what that has meant to you and what it's meant to your soldiers and your airmen and whatever it is your responsibilities are, and how the world has changed and that as a result of that, the military had to change to adapt to that? Yeah, Doctor.
I'm glad to start. The post-9/11 era, the threat of asymmetric warfare has been a real complicating factor. The United States Department of Defense has had to think about threats in a different way. Improvised explosive devices, the use of common industrial chemicals as weapons, suicide attacks has caused us to think about not just new equipment, but new ways of using that equipment. For instance, it isn't necessarily the best thing to put another thing in a soldier's rucksack. It might be the best thing to train them how to use that thing differently to counter a chemical or a pharmaceutical or an improvised explosive threat. So that's what we do at Dugway as well. We will have forces come in and train on real-world targets that are replications of in-theater threats so that they can rehearse their training, their tactics, their procedures against these asymmetric threats and be ready for them when they come.
How good are we at doing that?
We're not perfect, but we're pretty good.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that.
If I could add, I was in Europe when the wall came down, and I was one of those cold warriors that was doing the middle of the night exercises to respond to a potential Russian threat. A couple things, we overestimated the Russians in some respects, but they were formidable. But I would say the major change from then to now is that the military has gotten better from when you and I first got in. These individuals are smarter and more dedicated. They're all volunteers, and they're very technical. They have skills. And so we have a thing called the Center for Army Lessons Learned, and where we're reviewing, as the good doctor said, the techniques, tactics, and procedures of the enemy on a regular basis and feeding that into our training models so that we aren't caught, as he said, flat-footed, and we're preparing our people. But I'm impressed with the skill sets these young ones are bringing into our military. They've got a lot of cyber skills already innate in them, and they understand this asymmetrical world a lot better than some of us old folks do.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I can jump in real fast, sir. So from a munitions standpoint and logistics, logistics is pretty similar to what we were doing before the Cold War. However, the time frames that we deal with now are much shorter. So when we look at projecting power, we're doing things much faster than we used to. And as far as the munitions go, obviously we have much more technical, much more precise munitions now than we ever had before. And on our end, that requires maintenance and more surveillance within our stockpiles.
Check.
No, that was me. I think from our standpoint, the more technical these weapons become, obviously the harder it is for us to maintain them. So we're doing our part and we're getting better at doing it, but as those stockpiles age, it could be a concern in the future.
Colonel Gable, thoughts?
I'll go a little bit tactical on this just from what I've seen over the years. My first few years were pre-9/11, and our focus and most of our training, getting 200 hours a year or more of flying at that time, was focused on that high-end warfighting, large force on large force, a lot of multi-aircraft engagements and everything. Post 9/11, that changed, and close air support became our bread and butter and everything. So instead of going to red flag, which is you would spin up all year to go to your annual red flag, which was to simulate the first 10 sorties of a combat environment in a training environment, and they found the losses went down significantly during Vietnam by doing that. That's what red flag was for. Now, red flag is a distraction from it became a distraction from your green flag, which is a close air support exercise in conjunction at the National Training Center or the Joint Training Center with the Army. And your red flag was a distraction because what you were really there was to get that close air support training, because that's the fight you were going to fight. Not the one you were being ready for all the time, not the folded gap, not the big mass coming east, and you're ready to push it back west. Reverse that. Yeah. Geography is not my strong point. So nowadays, though, it's close air support, and now with the F-35, we're flying a platform that wasn't initially designed for close air support. It was designed for that large force, folded gap, defeat the enemy at range and all that, and we are adapting it, and we're doing very well with what we can do with it in a close air support fight. But that is our change. Close air support became our primary mission, whether it was to train us or to train the controllers on the ground who need a lot of controls. That became our standard, and we're reversing that now slowly.
And I'm going to share my own experience with that as well. Before I do, Rick, we want to close this at 1:05, is that right? Yeah, okay. So one more question after this. I think I can illustrate from my experience some of the changes as well. When I graduated from pilot training, I actually had I graduated first in my class, could choose anything I wanted. I was going to go fly F-15s in Europe, I thought. And someone convinced me to come fly helicopters in special ops. And one of the reasons was they said, we're not gone as much. Oh my heavens. Okay, so now you go talk to those special forces guys, and how often are they gone? Deployment after deployment after deployment, month after month after month. That certainly changed, and I speak about that in my own experience, but generally the demand on our soldiers has meaningfully changed. We've got soldiers that are spending far more time away from home than they anticipated when they signed up. And then to Colonel, your point about the B-1 that I flew was designed is a nuclear weapon system designed to be a strategic deterrent against Russia. And we found ourselves doing a 9-line, if you know what that is, writing down on a piece of paper, because we're going to drop munitions in soldiers in close contact. I mean, soldiers that are in contact a few hundred meters, maybe closer. And we're doing that from a weapon system that wasn't designed to do it. And you have a guy up there, and he's writing this down on a piece of paper, and I remember thinking, and I never dropped in that situation, by the way. But even in training, I remember thinking, if I make one-digit mistake, I kill my own guys. That's a bad deal. And again, it was demands put on airmen and on weapons that they just weren't really designed for that, but we had to adapt. Okay, we're going to conclude, but I'd like to ask this question, and just ending on a little bit of a different note, a bit of a positive note. Share with us your experience with Utah's support with you and your soldiers, will you? And tell us, I hope, that the community supports you and is encouraging in what you do.
Dugway has great support from the surrounding community, from the state of Utah and the Utah delegation. We partner regularly and tightly with the Utah Test and Training Range and the Air Force and Hill Air Force Base and the use of our joint airspace. The combined airspace over Dugway and the Utah Test and Training Range is the longest contiguous piece of DoD airspace on the continent, and it's busy. We use it and the Air Force uses it. We provide live fire training exercises for the National Guard, as well as all of the other services and all of their components, active, reserve, and we feel very supported. We're very proud to be a part of that coalition, and I think the strength of the Utah Defense Alliance lies in the fact that we are tight-knit and collaborative in everything that we do.
Yeah, and I would echo those comments as well, Congressman. So really out at Tooele, I've only been there a month, and I came from DC, so the people here might be a little...
I feel like I'm on the prison walls watching you run away, and it's like, run, Colonel, run.
Right, so you're well aware of some of the differences here, but the folks here are fantastic. As far as just an incredibly patriotic population, it's really amazing to me. And when I visit with folks out at the depot, is talking with them about their other family members that work at the depot and have worked at the depot, and generations of families that have literally grown up at the depot, and that's just really, really amazing to me, and just completely fantastic support from everybody.
And I'll echo that, and it's not just because it's a Utah crowd in front of us. I mean, I would say in front, and I have said in front of many crowds. Seen a lot of bases, seen a lot of support. It's all good support. Utah's great support. I look around, I see some usual faces that I see at all of our functions up at Hill. And the airspace that the doctor talks about, that I will tell you that's a national treasure that no one else has. The F-35 is just one user of that, and we're the secondary user. It's a test range primarily as far as the Air Force is concerned, and that is what that piece of real estate that I'm sure frustrates some people, but what that brings to the warfighter is amazing, and the support that we get at all levels to keep that alive and well and fight back encroachment opportunities just by dialogue and explaining what that will cost us, and the fact that Utah and the population of Utah, for the most part, supports that is amazing. We had a noise town hall last night, and only out of all the people that were there, one complaint. I'm sure there's more, but only one person showed up to complain about our noise, and the rest were there just to get an understanding about why we do what we do. And when we got that why out and they understood, even the one complaint changed because he understood that there's a reason for how we fly how we do up north. And so the support on all levels is amazing.
Good. Jeff, anything?
Yeah, sure. I've lived all over the country, and I can tell you that Utah is special and unique in this level of support. I've seen some of it in other states, but the community comes together. You see the sign behind Mr. Larson there, our leader, civil society. That's what makes America great, and that is folks getting involved. And to give you one example in closing, I was at an event last night at Zions Bank, and this bank has hired 101. They just hired their 101st military intern, and it's a program to train veterans how to make the transition away from the military into civil society and a civil job. And of that group, 56 were hired by the bank, 43 were hired by other companies, the others went back to school. It's an amazing program, and that's just indicative of what happens in the state of Utah with regard to the military. Wonderful support from the governor's office all the way down to that small business owner that supports us when we deploy. For instance, I've got a guy that's gone 8 times in the last 17 years. And these aren't 2 or 3 month deployments, they're a year and a half. 8 times. And imagine that impact on that employer. And the employers absorb that and support us. And we can't do it without you. Thank you.
Well, let me conclude by Dr. Gritton, Colonel Burnley, Colonel Gable, General Burton, thank you. And we think, and I can promise you, Utah does support you. But we wish you would take this message back to your soldiers and airmen. That is that millions of Americans pray for them. They want them to be safe and successful. Thank them for their service, and thank their families. And I always remember this. Every time you see a young soldier overseas, young man or young woman, someone back home is missing them. A mother back home is wondering who's going to shovel my walk when it snowed 2 feet last night. The car won't start, and she may not know what to do. Families sacrifice as well. A young kid in high school who's struggling with something would like to talk to his mom or his dad, and he hasn't seen him because he's been deployed 8 times. So please tell them that we're grateful for their sacrifice as well. Thank you for being here today, and for all of you for joining us.
We're going to now invite our second panel to the stage. This will be moderated by Congressman Stewart's Chief of Staff, Chris Harmer, a wonderful individual with true perspective on everything we're talking about here today. So let's welcome to the stage now David Bean, Perry Oaks, Andy Healy, and Justin McMurray.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I want to tell a brief historical analogy. You didn't come here for a history lecture from me, so I'll make this very quick, but it ties into the industry representatives today. December 6, 1941, the U.S. Navy was secure in its base at Pearl Harbor, certain in the knowledge that the Japanese Navy could never strike that far. The U.S. Navy War College had gamed out every possible scenario for conflict. And the one thing they had never suspected was that the Japanese Navy could attack the U.S. Navy in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Navy disproved all of the U.S. Navy's theories, and of course, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, a significant portion of the Pacific Fleet was sunk, a significant portion of our support facilities were wrecked. Fortunately for us, we had the geographic advantage, being the United States of America. We were separated from our German enemies by the width of the Atlantic Ocean, and also the Germans had some other people they were fighting at the time, and also we were separated from our Japanese enemies by the width of the Pacific Ocean, and also the Japanese were fighting somebody else at the time. Point being, we had time to ramp up. We had time for the industrial base to get ready to fight this war, a war that had been totally predictable and predicted, but for which we were still completely unprepared from a materiel perspective, meaning the U.S. Army Air Corps did not have adequate airframes, the U.S. Army Ground Forces did not have adequate rolling stock, they didn't have trunks, they did not have enough trucks, infantry carriers, main battle tanks, they were far behind the Germans. The U.S. Navy, the same thing. Our frontline fighters were significantly inferior to the top-end Japanese and German fighters. Point being, U.S. industry had time to ramp up. 18 months after Pearl Harbor, we had a significant material and logistic advantage over both the Germans and Japanese, and at that point it was just a matter of filling in the blanks and attriting the enemy to victory. I don't think we're going to have that ramp-up time before our next conflict. I can't tell you when it's going to come. What I can say is that my reading of history indicates that armed conflict between nation states, and now increasingly terrorist organizations, is not the exception to the rule, it is the norm, and I expect it to be that way for the foreseeable future. With that in mind, I'd like to ask our panelists what each of their companies are doing to prepare, or two questions, it's a two-part question. First, do you concur in my assessment that we will not have that ramp-up time? And if I'm correct in that, and by all means if I'm not, I'm happy to hear the counter-argument, but if we don't have time to ramp up after the attack, whenever it comes, what are we doing now to prepare for it? And as you answered, if you could give us a brief introduction of who you are and who you represent. Right to left will work.
Okay. I'm David Bean. I'm at L3. I work primarily Air Force issues. L3 is, we've actually been here in this area about 60 years. We're about a dozen buildings right here across from the airport with 3,500, a little over 3,500 employees. We do communications, and I didn't realize it, Congressman, I'm also retired B-1 aviator. I was a satisfied L3 customer. I didn't even know it when I was in combat. L3 makes the data links that control the drones on the other side of the world. We also make the links that send back the videos from the drones from the other side of the world. When I was in the B-1, we have a camera as well, and we would send it down, the video down to the ground, to the soldier, to the Marine. They would look at it on their device and say, no, go over one more street. Okay, follow that van right there. So I would, and then possibly drop bombs after that on whatever he told me to. L3 makes the widget that sends the the video down to the soldier or the Marine, and then L3 also makes the gear that he's looking at that picture with, too. So that's kind of where L3 is coming from, and we are absolutely kind of dovetailing to the previous conversation, working with the military now to kind of transition from the war we've been fighting over the last 15, 18 years to more of a come-as-you-are, near-peer threat, where we're no longer in the wheel, flying over the enemy without being shot at and dropping bombs on them. We're helping the military now prepare for a fight your way in, attack the target if you have to, and fight your way back out. That I agree. We have to come as we are. We're not going to have a ramp-up time. So that's kind of where we're focusing now, more on standoff, low observable stealth technology.
Thank you.
I'm Perry Oakes with Lockheed Martin, and we probably just went over 500 Lockheed employees in the state, and I'm the senior corporate guy here, and my job is to help connect the dots. It's really great when I'm dealing with my grandkids and telling them what Grandpa does, but because I can take a coloring pen and connect the dots for them, because I'm trying to connect what Lockheed does around our 100,000 person corporation with what the requirements are for the different services, and with the different program offices that Air Force has here in Utah and other services, and how can we help fulfill those requirements. We're partnered with the Air Force out at Hill Air Force Base specifically with the F-22 and the F-35, public-private partnership, where we do the modifications on those airplanes to help keep them up to the standards which they need to be able to use in combat. You talk about ramp-up time. See, I'd almost say that's what we constantly are doing as we field new systems. We know we won't have that time, so we're ramping up now. And part of what probably has hurt over the years has been the cuts that have taken place in the defense budget, which don't allow us to, say, get to full rate production. And I'll say on the F-35, we're slow leaking it out and being able to get the aircraft into service quicker, to get the pilots trained and be able to be there when the country will need us. And you ask, so what are we doing now, prepare? We're helping to solve those, fulfill the requirements which the services have. General Hyten has talked for the last couple of years on go faster, and we have to be able to go faster. If you look at defense acquisition programs, the amount of years it takes to field something, it's sort of ridiculous. And if we're able to go faster and make the mistakes as we go along, we will learn. We will probably learn more as a country from the Minuteman missile that was fired early this week, which went off course and had to be terminated. We will learn more as a defense industry and services from that failure than we would have from a correct flight.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andy Healy with Boeing. You passed one of our commercial aircraft facilities on the way here. They do work for all the structures within all the commercial airplanes that Boeing uses, cockpits, stabilizers, things like that. I'm part of Boeing Defense, Space, and Security, and specifically I work in the strategic deterrence business area. Retired 3 years ago from the Air Force after 25 years doing ICBMs pretty much the whole time. 3 years now with Boeing. So while I could talk at length about KC-46s and B-52s, ground-based mid-course defense, other Boeing areas in defense, most of my expertise on both the industry and the DoD side is in the ballistic missile area. So I think industry in general, we are caught up, we are ramped up when it comes to some of the conventional, some of the strategic threats that we've had out there. We see what our adversaries are doing, as the Congressman alluded to, and how they are building new systems, and we are now forging ahead with that, as we are with our worthy competitor in the GBSD replacement ICBM to the Boeing Minuteman III. But it's the areas that we've also talked about where, hypersonics, cyber, things like that, where we're trying to figure out what does the future hold and how will our adversaries come at us in ways that we haven't anticipated in the future. And so how do we do that? Well, tight relationship with our DoD customer, tight relationship with the needs of the warfighter and understanding what they need and what they forecast that they're going to need, and then we drive the innovation and the budgets towards that. So, we're proud to work with over 100 businesses here in Utah. We've been very successful drawing people into Utah from other areas of the country to work for Boeing, not only in strategic deterrence, but in other areas of the company. So, I think the bottom line is, you continue doing what you've been doing, and you innovate.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Justin McMurray. I'm with Northrop Grumman, business unit director for many of the operations in Utah, and we've got folks deployed around the country and around the world supporting our warfighters and making the nation safe. Here at home, just down the road from here, we have a facility, Northrop Grumman Navigation Systems, that makes the inertial navigation systems in many of the aircraft that you fly on that keep you safe. It's really important to know where you are, as I'm sure the congressman knows from his experience. If you don't know where you are, there can be really catastrophic results. So that organization does a phenomenal job of making sure we can track exactly where we are. If you head a little bit further north in Clearfield, we support our colleagues at Lockheed Martin in building parts of the F-35 and our experts in composite manufacturing at our facility in Clearfield, as well as solid rocket motor production throughout the state here. We've got work that we do within the state on sustaining and extending the life of many legacy aircraft systems. I'm sure our friends in the Army are very grateful for the A-10 aircraft, and every day we continue to extend the life and make sure that that plane is safe to protect our warfighters there. We also support the F-5 and T-38 aircraft, and the T-38 has trained over 60,000 pilots on how to operate safely, and I'm sure a number in the room have flown on T-38 aircraft as well. We have a great opportunity to support the Air Force and work together with a number of my colleagues here. Much of my background is in ICBMs as well, like Andy. And so supporting on Minuteman III and preparing for GBSD is another important part of our business here in Utah as well. Back to your question on rapid response time and being ready for it. The attack on Pearl Harbor, just before the attack happened, they had this new thing called a radar. And the radar had blips coming in, and they knew something was about to happen. And on those blips, they said, oh, it's just got to be our aircraft, coming over from California here to support us. Don't worry about it, right? So what are the blips we're having today in our traditional environments, and what are the blips in the emerging environments, and what are we doing about it? So cybersecurity is a really important one, right? What are those blips that are popping up today, and what are the preparations that we're making so that we know we don't have those 18 months, but how are we going to be ready when we're called to battle? And every day, there's something popping on the radar that we have to address.
Thank you. I hate to bring up a contentious subject, but it's relevant to what we're talking about today, and that is, as Congressman Stewart alluded to previously, if you could each briefly address how the impact of intermittent funding on your organization. I'll tell you from a perspective, my final job in the Navy, my final active duty billet, I was base operations officer for Naval Air Station North Island, and intermittent funding just wreaked havoc on our ability to plan and execute. So we went from being proactive to being completely reactive. And my biggest problem there was we had 3 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers stationed at Naval Air Station North Island, which I inexplicably became individually responsible for the security of, despite having no background in security. That just kind of comes with the territory of being a base operations officer. So we looked at all our threat scenarios, and what we absolutely needed was consistency in training and simulating attacks so we would know how to appropriately respond to that. And when the funding got cut off, as it consistently did, restoring funding doesn't restore the capability that is lost when that funding is shut down. My impression is that's even more true for a civilian or a private enterprise that's trying to develop new technologies as well as deliver component systems and services. If you could talk about the impact of CR and how important or how beneficial it would be for you to get away from that. When I say for you to get, how beneficial would it be to you if we in DC could get away from that? Go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, you hit the nail on the head. It's very difficult to plan. You know, historically, the military is planned in 5-year blocks, as it were, the Future Years Defense Plan, the FIDIP. And so just like the military can't plan, likewise, industry can't plan, especially if they're getting funded even by, we talked about the OCO gimmick before, how the Pentagon's using money from the OCO spending, that extra money that's so nebulous. It might be there the next year, it might not. So it disincentives, there is no incentive for industry to invest in their own technology because they don't know if that technology will be used beyond the next year that it's getting paid for. And I think that ends up costing the taxpayer more because then the government's going to have to pay for that technology if they want it down the road because the industry isn't using their own internal R&D money, the IRAD money. So I think it ends up costing the taxpayers as well.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt at all about that. I mean, every budget study has come to that same conclusion that even if you restore funding after a shutdown, you wind up losing money in the long term because you can't replace the capability that was lost. It costs more to replicate. Anybody who's served in active duty in the military knows if you skip training, you can't just replicate that training 6 months later and expect the same benefit out of it. You've got to train more to make up for what you've missed. And so I know Congressman Stewart spends a lot of time and a lot of focus working with leadership on a return to something approaching a normal budget process, but I appreciate your comments. Go ahead, sir.
You know, as I was driving in this morning, all of a sudden my car beeped at me and said I was low on gas, and I figured I didn't want to run out of gas on the way here, so I stopped. Well, you got to stop for gas. Gas means to me, it always means a soda. Well, you go to the soda, you know, and so I go grab my Diet Mountain Dew, and I can get one for $1.89, and if I buy two, it's only $1 more. It's the same thing. We're being cut back so much on not being allowed to invest, and it's our suppliers as well. When you think if I was buying a case. If I'm buying a case, I'm able to buy them for almost $1 a piece or less than $1 the whole one. It's the same thing in the defense industry. We get to certain quantity rates, and we're able to work with our suppliers and get better deals. It's that same, and if I buy two, I get that extra one just for $1. It's that same thing as you go through. We talk on, and I spend a lot of my time now on F-35 sustainment. And if you read anything in the press, it's how expensive the F-35 is. We talk three things. We talk readiness, rate, and capacity. On the readiness, we're talking spares. And if you ask Colonel Gable on the spares, if he's talking to his maintainers, some of the spares aren't there. Because with the funding we have, we're having to go to production line and not as many on the initial spares to be able to sustain the airplanes when they're in the field. The other goes to rates. I mentioned earlier, you get to full rate production. We're negotiating Lot 11 at a low rate initial production. Lot 11. We're not projected to get to full rate until 2023, I believe. The quicker you can get to a full rate production, the quicker you can get those quantity discounts, and we'll get that down to a $80 million airplane. And the last thing is we talk capacity, and capacity ends up being tooling for our suppliers. If we're able to have that proper predictability on funding, we're able to do the proper planning and be able to invest in our suppliers so they can have the capacity to support us in the long run.
Perry, I want to ask one follow-up question there. A lot of the major defense contractors like you are really integrators of thousands of subcomponents. As a large corporation, I'm not saying you enjoy the intermittent funding, but you can survive it. How's the impact on your subcomponent suppliers?
Okay, I'll stick with the F-35. We already have suppliers for the F-35 who come back and say, look, we can't count on you. We can't afford to stay in business, so we're looking for additional suppliers to have to replace them, which is not cheap.
And what happens when you have a subcomponent supplier that goes out of business because of the unpredictable funding? What does that do to the total cost?
It just increases it.
Yeah.
Because we spend time,
and
so then sometimes you have to go in second, third tier, third level suppliers, which is just more money and more time. Because if I bring up a new supplier today, I'm not going to get anything from that supplier for probably 2 to 3 years.
And you're going to have to float them financially for a certain amount of time until they're
That's
ready
exactly
to produce.
right, which is more risk upon us and upon our first-tier suppliers.
And ultimately, that cost is all borne, A, by the taxpayer in higher cost, B, by the service in a lesser or decreased or delayed capability.
Yeah.
And it, you know, it goes to also the ability of to be able to provide the warfighter with what they need rapidly. And for example, in the ballistic missile, in the nuclear world, everything has to be manufactured in the United States, period, end of sentence. So if you don't have a supplier, or the supplier has lapsed because you haven't ordered any in 10 years, now you have to go out, requalify a supplier, get it approved. There might be additional certifications required, and so what should be an easy thing to procure, produce, and get out to the field could take a significant amount of time. And you're right, there's a degree of, you know, in that time, does the budget change? Do things shift in priorities for DOD and for the nation and cause that? And I'll contrast that with, you know, the late 1950s, 1958, the government told General Schriever, we want you to produce Minuteman missiles. Okay, so Boeing got a contract, and by 1962, Minuteman missiles they had dug the holes. They were on alert in time for the Cuban Missile Crisis, which nobody could have anticipated in the late 50s, but they were there, and President Kennedy could leverage them. Within 9 years, and by 1967, there were 1,000 Minuteman missiles on alert because of the national urgency, the steady funding, that they were able to compete suppliers against each other. We were able to get good rates, things like that. Fast forward 60 years, it's way too dicey, and so the company adapts to support what the DoD needs, but there's only so much flexibility in any given year. And it comes at the cost of a lot of times the small businesses.
Thank you.
You know, we talk a lot about how our adversaries are going fast and how we need to keep up and be faster than them at getting new technologies out there and being ready for the fight. Andy shared some great historical examples. Another one is the great speech by John F. Kennedy. We're going to put a man on the moon, and we're going to do it this decade. Very clear, very direct requirements. Tell me what you need. Let's plan for it. Let's lay it out. Let's make it happen. And they did it, right? If we can do the same, we can achieve great things. I think about a football team. And you go to the football team and you say, okay, I know you guys were supposed to get ready for the game next week, and we were going to watch some footage after this to get ready, and we were, you know, going to study what our adversaries were going to do here. But instead, I need you to hold for 6 months, right? I need you guys to go do something else, and then in 6 months, I'm going to be ready for you. It's not the right way to prepare for the battles that we have in front of us. And from the supplier impacts, from the long-term planning, from the strategic distractions that happen at all levels of the military, civilian and military, trying to plan for all those contingencies, takes a great toll on our readiness overall. If we could be proactive in saying strategically, here's what we're going to do with our systems for a long term, and be consistent in our funding, be ready to go with new starts, it would have a dramatic improvement on our readiness and our warfighting ability.
Thank you. I want to talk briefly, another very brief historical example. Back in the 1980s, or historically, the reason submarines got useful was you couldn't see them. Once they went underwater, they couldn't be seen. Fairly quickly, anti-submarine warfare figured out you've got to listen for submarines. That's how you find submarines. You can't see them. You can only hear for them. Very quickly, submarine producers figured out the best way to keep the stealth characteristics of a submarine is to reduce the noise emitted, and eventually got to the point where the U.S. Navy had the quietest submarines on Earth, astonishingly, because we made the best propellers. I don't want to get into the details of it other than to say the Russians were very interested in how the United States Navy made propellers. So the Soviet Union made a targeted investment in a espionage operation and eventually stole that technology. But it took them about 6 years of effort. By the time they got that technology, what they had stolen was 6 years old, okay, which is still a massive leap ahead for the Soviet Navy, which was not qualitatively that good. And they actually stole it through a Japanese supplier, Toshiba, if any remember that from the 1980s. Today, our enemies can steal more intellectual property in 2 seconds than they could something that would take them years and years of effort just to get physical blueprints, analog printouts, readouts. It would take a massive effort that could be interdicted at any time. Today, your intellectual property can be stolen in a microsecond. Tell me how that's affected how you approach business and how you relate that to your service to the both the military and the taxpayers.
Yeah, very briefly, IP theft is costing the nation something like $1 trillion a year. It affects the taxpayer, and obviously it affects the businesses. Part of the problem with the businesses is once our technology is stolen, that means it's back to the drawing board for us to develop a different technology, more advanced technology. So again, we pass the cost on to the taxpayer. So it gets frustrating in that sense. But I think all of us work with the Defense Security Service, DSS, in reporting illegal attempts to get into our systems. There's lots of countermeasures that DSS shares with us. We share best practices for industry. So it's just an ongoing, very, very much at the forefront of our minds.
Thank you. Appreciate the response.
Yeah, and if anybody would doubt what our adversaries are doing, just go Google pictures of our weapon systems and the Russians and Chinese. I mean, you go back to the B-1, the adversary's B-1, it looks exactly the same. F-22, F-35, it's there, and they're stealing it, and it makes our life miserable. I think all the firewalls that I have to deal with just working with within the Lockheed system, it's so frustrating day to day to get my work done. I can go home and say, shoot, I can do better on Compacast than I can do at work. And yet we live with it because we know that folks are trying to get in and attack us. And the amount of people we have working to keep our IP secure is just phenomenal. And it's just another tax, in a sense, that we have to pass on because just to do business.
Yeah, Congressman Stewart likes to make the analogy or the observation that the Chinese adversary, the Chinese military, has skipped entire generations of weapons research and development simply by stealing that technology from us. Yeah. Certainly the Navy, all of the military services, I think, have been surprised at how quickly the Chinese military has grown, not just in terms of size, but in terms of qualitative capabilities. Nowhere's that more apparent than the Chinese Navy. For their entire history, they've been purely a defensive-minded Navy. In an extraordinarily short period of time, they developed the ability to deploy forces at a distance, and that's almost exclusively due to the fact that they stole all that technology to figure that stuff out instead of using the trial and error the way normal people develop their technology.
Boeing obviously operates worldwide, and we have arguably the largest corporate or commercial network in the world, and we have to keep it secure, both on the commercial aircraft side and on the military side, operating globally. So it's a big focus and has been ever since the company set that up. And then obviously, as you get into more of the defense programs, that ramps up into our classified areas as well, and the ability to transmit and use information in a meaningful way and talk with others in a classified or in a secure environment. So it's something that we've been out in front of and staying ahead of to keep intellectual property as well as Defense Department and other classified data secure. And I'll commend the GBSD program and the Air Force for ramping up the security at the outset of that program. And while it's been a little bit of a challenge for all three of us, the government, Boeing, and Northrop, to sort of adjust to a different security paradigm than Minuteman has, it's absolutely essential and it's the right way to go. So I think the bottom line is the more you connect and the more you focus on cyber and work with the various customers to foresee where things are going to go in the future, the better off you can lead turn that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So back to your question on what are we doing about it. I got an updated threat briefing on Monday, right? We're always making changes. We're trying to stay ahead of what our adversaries are doing. We have a team 24/7 that's monitoring our network, and we've got people in place that are working very closely with our suppliers to make sure that the data that goes to them is not the weak point for our adversaries to take that on. There's many improvements that are going on, many focus areas. As Andy said, there's things that traditionally we wouldn't have taken classified as early as we have, and recognizing the cybersecurity threat, we've made those changes early on to make sure that that data does not get in the wrong hands and set us back strategically.
Well, thank you very much for your responses and participation. This time I'd like to turn time back over to Rick Larson.
We just want to conclude by thanking everyone who's participated. We certainly thank Congressman Stewart and his entire office. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all of you for attending. And just a last announcement, I just want to let you all know, as we were talking about appreciation for the military and this community, Sutherland is engaging on a social media campaign, and you have a handout regarding this. Between now and Veterans Day in November, we're going to be highlighting the importance of each and every installation in the state, their major activities and contributions. And we feel like that's a fitting tribute to the men and women who serve so selflessly. And with the amount of service going on in the state of Utah, we feel like it's important to highlight that leading up to Veterans Day. So we hope you'll all take the opportunity to log on to sutherlandinstitute.org, sign up for the newsletter, and help us celebrate and share this great military culture that we enjoy in the state of Utah. Again, thanks to all of you. Thanks for enduring the heat, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next installation of the Sutherland Congressional Series. Thank you.